In 1889, workers cataloguing fragments in the British Museum's Department of Ancient Near Eastern Antiquities logged an entry for tablet BM 78941, a clay shard no larger than an adult hand, its surface dense, with wedge-shaped impressions so fine they seemed carved by insect legs rather than human. Stylus. The object had arrived decades earlier from the ruins of Nineveh, mixed among thousands of other pieces excavated from King Ashurbanipal's library, a 7th century Beis archive buried when the Assyrian capital fell. For years it sat in storage, one broken voice among countless others, waiting for someone who could read Akkadian cuneiform to understand what it was trying to say. When scholars finally translated the fragment in the early 20th century, they found themselves reading something unexpected. This wasn't a king's boast or a god's praise hymn. It was a record, procedural, administrative, almost clinical in tone, describing a crisis between divine authority and human population. The tablet preserves part of an epic known today as Atrahasis, composed originally in Old Babylonian around 1700 BC, copying traditions already ancient when the scribes first pressed reed to clay. And at its centre sits a moment the Sumerians and their successors found significant enough to copy, preserve, and transmit across centuries. The moment when humanity, for reasons the text takes pains to document, stopped complying with the expectations of the Anunnaki gods who had created them. If you're listening to this from somewhere quiet, your bed, a chair, the stillness of late evening, drop a comment telling us where you are and what time it is. We're building something here, a community of people who find these old questions worth the hours it takes to examine them properly. The Atrahasis epic doesn't present this as a sudden rebellion, a dramatic uprising with speeches and battle lines. It describes something stranger and more procedural, an escalation. Humans multiplied, they became loud. The god Enlil, chief administrator of earthly affairs and holder of authority over the tablet of destinies that governed cosmic order, found the noise intolerable. He didn't immediately destroy them. Instead, the text records a sequence of measured interventions, plague first, then drought, then famine, each one designed to reduce human population and restore tolerable conditions. And at each stage, the text suggests humans found ways around the divine solution. This isn't the language of mythology as we usually encounter it. There are no monsters here, no heroes with magic swords. The Atrahasis reads more like a case file, a record kept by administrators trying to solve a problem that kept adapting, kept refusing to resolve according to plan. The word the text uses for the human noise that disturbed Enlil is Rigmu in Akkadian, Huber in Sumerian, terms that can mean literal sound, clamour, uproar, but which some scholars suggest might also carry connotations of disorder, loss of control, perhaps even a refusal of proper reverence. The mainstream academic interpretation treats it as overpopulation noise, pure and simple. But even accepting that reading, the question remains, why did this specific problem, human volume and number, trigger such a systematic divine response? Tablet BM 78941 is broken. The top half survives, the bottom lost to time or accident. What remains shows 3 columns per side, the script tiny and precise, the clay baked hard either by ancient fire or by the flames that consumed Nineveh when it fell. The text on the surviving portion describes the gods' council meeting, the debate over what should be done about humanity's refusal to diminish quietly when asked. Other fragments from the same composition survive in museum collections. BM 78943 preserves another portion of the flood decision. Tablets excavated from Sippar and Nippur add pieces to the narrative. The Metropolitan Museum in New York holds a fragment describing the plague sequence. Scholars working with W.G. Lambert and A.R. Millard's 1969 reconstruction of the epic have assembled these scattered pieces into a coherent whole, though gaps remain, silences in the record where the clay didn't survive or hasn't yet been found. The story the tablets preserve suggests something that doesn't fit neatly into our categories of myth or history. It describes a time when humans were created for a specific purpose, to perform labour that divine beings no longer wished to perform themselves. And then it describes the moment when that arrangement began to fail. Not because humans stopped working necessarily, but because they multiplied beyond the carrying capacity the gods had intended. They became too many, too loud, too present. And when divine authority tried to correct this through conventional means, disease, resource scarcity, environmental pressure, humans adapted. They survived. They found ways to continue. The text doesn't celebrate this. It simply records it, with the same neutral precision a bureaucrat might use to document a policy failure. Enlil tried plague, the humans endured. He tried drought, they managed. He tried famine, they reorganized. And finally, the text tells us he convened the divine assembly and proposed a solution that couldn't be adapted to, couldn't be survived by cleverness or endurance, water, a flood comprehensive enough to return the earth to silence. But even this plan, the text reveals, didn't proceed as intended, because one god, Enki, the craftsman, the wise one, the deity associated with fresh water and secret knowledge, chose to warn one human, a man the Sumerians called Ziusudra, the Babylonians called Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, depending on the telling, a man who listened when the others didn't or couldn't or chose not to. And in that choice, in that warning and the survival it enabled, the text preserves something else, evidence that the divine authority itself was divided, that the decision to end humanity wasn't unanimous, that even among the gods there was debate about whether this refusal merited extinction. The tablets from Nineveh are Neo-Assyrian copies made in the 7th century BC, but they reproduce texts far older. The Atrahasis composition itself dates to the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC. Behind that lies the Sumerian tradition, fragments like the Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, excavated from Nippur and dating to approximately 1600 BC in its written form, though the story it tells was certainly older, transmitted orally before. Being committed to clay. These aren't different stories. They're different versions of the same memory, copied and recopied across centuries, translated from Sumerian to Akkadian, preserved in city after city, archive after archive, as if the event they describe mattered enough that losing the record would be a greater disaster than losing the cities themselves. What were they preserving? Not instructions for ritual, not religious doctrine, not even history in the sense we usually mean it. They were preserving a case study in the failure of authority, a record of what happened when the created refused to accept the limitations their creators imposed, a document showing that even divine governance could encounter resistance it couldn't easily suppress, populations that wouldn't quietly reduce themselves when ordered to do so, survival strategies that adapted faster than punishment could contain. The text doesn't tell us that humans were right to refuse. It doesn't tell us they were wrong. It simply shows us what happened, the escalation, the debate, the decision, the flood, the survival. And then it shows us what came after, how the world was reorganized, how kingship was reinstituted, how the relationship between gods and humans was restructured with new terms, new expectations, perhaps new enforcement mechanisms. The tablets sit in museums now, in London and Oxford and Philadelphia and Istanbul, objects behind glass, their voices translated into English and German and French for scholars to debate. But they remain, these broken pieces of baked clay pressed into shape 700 years ago, carrying a question forward through time. What does it mean when the created stop obeying their creators? Not in sudden revolution, but in gradual, adaptive refusal, multiplying when asked to diminish, surviving when expected to die, finding ways around every barrier placed in their path until the only solution left is total erasure. The Atrahasis epic preserved this question. The libraries of Mesopotamia copied it, The archaeologists excavated it, the translators decoded it, and now it sits in climate-controlled archives, waiting for anyone curious enough to ask, what exactly were the Sumerians recording, and why did they think we'd need to know? Before the refusal, the Igigi precedent. The Atrahasis epic doesn't begin with humanity, it begins with a different crisis, an earlier refusal that set the conditions for everything that followed. The opening tablets describe a time before humans existed, when the cosmos was divided into spheres of responsibility, and the labour required to maintain creation fell to a class of divine beings the Akkadian texts call the Igigi. These were younger gods, lesser in rank than the great Anunnaki, who held authority over heaven, earth, and the subterranean freshwater ocean called the Apsu. The text is specific about the arrangement. The Igigi dug canals, cleared rivers, maintained irrigation systems, performed the physical work that kept the ordered world functioning. They did this for 40 years according to some passages, for longer according to others, time measured not in human terms, but in the endurance of those doing the work. Then they stopped. Tablet 1 of the Atrahasis describes the moment with procedural clarity. The Igigi, worn down by endless labour, convened among themselves. They made a decision. They burned their tools, the spades and baskets used for excavation work, the implements of their assigned tasks. Then they marched at night to the dwelling of Enlil, the god who administered earth and held authority over their labour assignments. The text preserves their approach. They surrounded his house while he slept, a confrontation staged not as battle but as demonstration, a collective withdrawal of labour presented as fait accompli rather than negotiation. Enlil, awakened by his vizier, responded as authority often does when challenged. He summoned the other great gods to council. Anu, the Sky Father, came from heaven. Enki, lord of the Apsu and god of wisdom, came from the waters below. The assembly convened not to suppress the rebellion, but to understand it, to determine whether the Igigi had legitimate grievance or merely weakness of character. The text records Enlil's question to them directly, "Why have you surrounded my house? Are you declaring war?" The Igigi responded with specificity. They weren't declaring war, they were declaring exhaustion. The work was too hard, they said, the distress too great, the labour literally killing them. The Akkadian term suggests not just fatigue, but something closer to consumption, a grinding down that couldn't continue. They presented their case not as subjects begging relief, but as workers identifying an unsustainable system. And notably, the Divine Assembly didn't dismiss this. Anu, presiding over the council, acknowledged the legitimacy of their complaint. The text records his statement, "The work is indeed too heavy. Their distress is excessive." This is where Enki intervened with a solution. If the work was necessary, and maintaining the irrigation systems, the rivers, the agricultural foundation of the ordered world was apparently non-negotiable, then the answer wasn't to eliminate the work, but to transfer it. Create a new class of being to perform the labour. Design them specifically for this purpose. Give them sufficient capacity to do the work, but not so much awareness that they'd refuse it the way the Igigi had. Make them mortal so their population could be controlled. Make them dependent on the gods for guidance, so rebellion would seem unthinkable. The text describes the creation process with the same procedural detail it applied to the rebellion. Enki proposed mixing clay with the blood of a god, specifically a god who had been involved in the Igigi uprising. The assembly selected a deity named Wiilu, sometimes called Geshtu-i in other versions, identified as one who had rationality, who possessed the quality that had enabled the Igigi to conceive of refusing their assigned tasks. They slaughtered this god. Nintu, the birth goddess, mixed his blood and flesh with clay. From this mixture she fashioned 14 pieces, 7 male, 7 female. The rationality of the slaughtered god entered the clay. The first humans received breath. The epic of creation, Enuma Elish, preserved on tablets including K549C in the British Museum's collection, offers a parallel account that emphasises different details. In Tablet 6 of that composition, after the god Marduk has defeated Tiamat and established cosmic order, he proposes the creation of humanity to perform the labour the gods find burdensome. The assembly surrenders the rebel leader Chingu, and from his blood, Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, creates humankind. The text states the purpose explicitly: let him be burdened with the toil of the gods, that they may freely breathe. These aren't contradictory accounts. They're complementary records of the same solution to the same problem. Divine beings refused to continue performing necessary labour, so a new category of being was designed to replace them. The texts preserve this not as divine benevolence, the creation of humanity as gift, but as administrative necessity. Humans weren't created for their own sake. They were created to solve a labour crisis caused by the first recorded refusal in the cosmic order, the moment when the Igigi said no more and made it stick. The Igigi rebellion succeeded. This is crucial to understanding what came later. The texts don't describe the Igigi being punished for their refusal. They describe them being relieved of their burden, promoted effectively to a higher status, freed from the labour that was grinding them down. Their refusal worked because they presented it collectively, because they framed it in terms the divine assembly recognised as legitimate, and because Enki offered an alternative that preserved the necessary work while acknowledging the unsustainability of the previous system. So humanity entered existence knowing, or perhaps the text suggests they should have known, that refusal was possible within this cosmos, that even divine authority could be successfully challenged if the challenge was collective and the grievance legitimate, that the system could be reorganised when it became unsustainable. The Igigi precedent established all of this, encoded it into the very blood and clay from which the first humans were formed. The rationality of Wei-Ilu, the god who possessed the quality of being able to conceive of resistance, became part of human nature according to the text, not as flaw, but as inheritance. The gods literally built the capacity for refusal into the beings they created to replace the beings who had refused. The Louvre Museum in Paris holds tablets catalogued as AO7836, fragments from the myth of Enki and Ninmah, a Sumerian composition that approaches the creation of humanity from yet another angle. In this version, the gods are labouring and complaining, and Enki lies sleeping, or perhaps pretending to sleep, while his mother Nama brings the god's grievance to him. She tells him to rise, to use his wisdom to create a substitute who can bear the work the gods are performing. Enki responds by describing how to make humanity from the clay of the Apsu, the primordial waters he controls. He instructs Ninmah, the birth goddess, in the process. She forms humans, and the text describes a testing phase, Ninmah and Enki creating various types of humans, some with disabilities, some with limited capacities, determining what design will serve the intended purpose while remaining sustainable for both creators and created. This version includes something the Babylonian accounts largely omit: negotiation about the design itself. Enki and Ninmah debate what kinds of beings should exist, what limitations are appropriate, what capacities necessary. The text presents creation not as single divine pronouncement, but as iterative process, experiment and adjustment, an attempt to find a balance that will hold. The fact that multiple versions of this story survived, that Sumerian and Akkadian scribes kept copying different tellings across centuries, suggests they found the question genuinely important. How do you create beings capable enough to perform complex labour, but limited enough that they won't? Refuse it the way the Igigi did? The answer the text suggests is that you can't. You can't design a being intelligent enough to do sophisticated work, but incapable of recognising when that work becomes unbearable. You can't install the rationality necessary for effective labour without also installing the capacity to evaluate whether the labour is sustainable. The Igigi rebellion proved this. Their refusal demonstrated that consciousness, once granted, includes the ability to judge one's own condition and to say no when that condition becomes intolerable. Humanity inherited this capacity. The texts are explicit about it. Humans received the flesh and blood of a god who had refused, who had stood with the Igigi in their demonstration, who possessed rationality as a defining characteristic. This wasn't accident or contamination. It was design, or at least the inevitable consequence of using divine substance to create mortal beings. You can't extract consciousness from its tendency to evaluate and resist. The Igigi, after the creation of humanity, disappear from most of the narratives. They become background figures, mentioned occasionally but no longer central to the cosmic drama. Their role, their labour, their burden transferred to the new beings formed from clay and divine blood. They achieved what they sought: relief, promotion to less grinding tasks, recognition that their complaint was legitimate. Their rebellion succeeded, and humanity became the solution to the problem their success created. This context matters for everything that follows in the Atrahasis epic. When humans later multiplied, when they became numerous and loud, when Enlil's response escalated from plague through famine to flood, the precedent of the Igigi hung over the entire crisis. Because the gods had already seen refusal succeed once, they had already reorganized their system once in response to collective resistance from beings they outranked, outpowered, and administered. The Igigi rebellion established that authority in this cosmos wasn't absolute, that even divine plans could be disrupted by subjects who found those plans unsustainable, that negotiation and reorganization were possible outcomes when the created challenged their creators. Humanity wasn't present for the Igigi rebellion, but humanity was created from its residue, formed in its aftermath, designed to solve the problem it created. The texts suggest humans carried forward something of that first refusal, inherited it in the blood of Wei'ilu, bore it as part of their fundamental nature. When humans later refused to diminish quietly, when Enlil demanded it, when they found ways around plague and drought and famine, when they survived longer and multiplied more than divine authority had planned for, were they really doing something unprecedented? Or were they simply enacting the capacity the gods had built into them, using the rationality they inherited from a god who had himself refused? The tablets don't answer this directly. They present the sequence: Igigi labour, Igigi rebellion, Igigi success, human creation, human multiplication, human refusal, divine response. The pattern sits there in the text, preserved across copies and translations, waiting for anyone reading to notice what it implies, that the crisis with humanity might have been predictable from the moment the gods decided to solve the Igigi problem by creating beings who carried forward the very capacity that had made the Igigi problem possible in the first place. Enki understood this, perhaps. The texts consistently present him as the god most sympathetic to humanity, most willing to help them survive the pressures Enlil imposed. Was this because Enki designed humans and felt responsibility for his creation, or because Enki recognized that he had built them from materials that inevitably carried forward the tendency to resist, and he honoured that inheritance even when it complicated divine administration? The question remains suspended in the texts, unanswered but persistently present, like the rationality of Wei'ilu himself, slaughtered but not destroyed, dissolved into clay but not eliminated, living forward in every human who would later refuse to comply with limits they found unbearable. The Igigi precedent established that refusal could work. Humanity would later test whether that remained true when the ones refusing weren't gods, but mortal beings made from mud and divine blood. Beings who could die, who could be controlled through famine and flood, who didn't have the power the Igigi had possessed. The test would determine whether the precedent applied universally or whether it had been a one-time exception, a reorganization that would never be repeated. The texts preserve both the precedent and the test. They sit in museums now, these fragmentary accounts of the first refusal and the human refusals that followed. BM 78941 and BM 78943 from the British Museum, CBS 10673 from Philadelphia, AO 7036 from Paris, scattered across institutions, reconstructed by scholars like Lambert and Millard into coherent narratives, translated into modern languages for anyone curious enough to ask, what happened when the gods first discovered that the beings they created to labour could decide to stop? And what happened when they discovered it again? The agreement no one remembered making. When archaeologists excavate ancient Near Eastern sites, they find contracts everywhere, clay tablets recording loans, property transfers, marriage arrangements, temple duties, the mundane bureaucracy of civilization pressed into clay and baked for permanence. These texts are explicit about terms. They name the parties involved, specify the obligations, include witness lists, sometimes add curses for anyone who breaks the agreement. Mesopotamian society ran on documented expectations, relationships formalized and preserved, so that memory wouldn't become the sole arbiter of who owed what to whom. The relationship between gods and humans appears nowhere in this format. No tablet survives, recording the moment when humanity formally agreed to the terms of their existence, accepted the obligations built into their creation, consented to the purpose for which they were designed. The texts describe humans being made, not humans agreeing to be made. They describe divine intention, Enki proposing humanity as solution to the Igigi labour crisis, the assembly approving the design, Nintu forming the first specimens from clay and divine blood, but they never describe humans accepting the arrangement or acknowledging the debt their existence implied. Perhaps the gods assumed agreement was automatic. After all, how could created beings object to the conditions of their creation when those conditions were established before the beings existed to object? The logic appears in the Enuma Elish, Tablet 6, where after Marduk orders the creation of humanity, the text states their purpose as simple fact: I will create a savage, his name shall be man. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they may be at ease. Not he will agree to serve, or he will voluntarily accept service, but he shall be charged, language of assignment, not negotiation. The Sumerian composition Enki and Ninmah, preserved partially on tablet CBS 02168 and related fragments in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's collection, describes the creation process as craftwork. Ninmah shapes humans from clay like a potter forming vessels. Enki provides instruction on technique, specifies the materials, clay from the Apsu, the freshwater source over which he held authority. The text describes a testing phase where various types of humans are created, some with physical limitations, others with different capacities. Enki and Ninmah engage in what reads like a demonstration of design skill, each trying to create a being the other cannot find appropriate use for. Ninmah forms humans with various disabilities. Enki finds roles and sustenance for each. Then Enki creates a being so limited it cannot properly function, and challenges Ninmah to care for it. The competition has a playful quality, gods enjoying their creative power, experimenting with possibilities. What's absent from this account is any indication that the beings being formed had input into their design. The text treats human creation as entirely unilateral, gods deciding what humans should be, what capacities they should have, what purposes they should serve. The clay doesn't consent to becoming human any more than it consented to remaining clay. The divine blood of Wei Ilu, mixed into the material, was taken from a slaughtered god, It wasn't offered voluntarily. The very substance of humanity, according to these texts, came from compulsion, a God executed, his essence repurposed, his rationality distributed into mortal forms that would carry it forward without having chosen to receive it. This creates a philosophical problem the texts seem aware of but never directly address. If humans were made for a purpose they didn't choose, given capacities they didn't request, assigned obligations they had no opportunity to refuse, then what exactly bound them to compliance? What made the divine expectation legitimate beyond raw power, beyond the simple fact that the gods were stronger and could enforce consequences? The texts offer an answer, though it's implicit rather than stated. The answer is maintenance. Humans needed the gods to survive. The Mesopotamian worldview, as preserved in countless texts, held that gods maintained cosmic order, ensured the floods came on schedule, kept the sun moving, regulated the seasons. In the Atrahasis epic, when Enlil sends drought, it works. Rain stops, crops fail, humans suffer. When he sends plague, people die. The gods controlled the systems humans depended on. This created a practical obligation even in the absence of formal agreement. You don't need a contract with the being who controls whether you eat or starve. The power relationship itself establishes the terms. But maintenance can become manipulation when it's withdrawn strategically. The Atrahasis text describes Enlil doing exactly this, using drought not to regulate climate, but to punish human population, weaponizing environmental systems against the beings who depended on them. This moves the relationship from gods maintain the world humans live in to gods use their control over the world as leverage to force human compliance. The distinction matters. One is stewardship that humans benefit from, the other is coercion using withheld necessities as threat. The instructions of Shurupak, one of the oldest pieces of wisdom literature from ancient Mesopotamia, offers a human perspective on the divine relationship. Preserved on multiple tablets, including several catalogued in the CDLI database as Literary 000782, the text presents advice from Shurupak, a city that, according to the Sumerian king list, existed before the flood, to his son Zusudra, who would later become the flood survivor. The composition dates to approximately 2600-2500 BCE in its earliest attestations, making it older than the Atrahasis epic itself, perhaps preserving the viewpoint of the humans who lived before the crisis the later texts describe. The instructions emphasize proper behavior toward gods, but the phrasing is revealing. Shurupak tells his son to make offerings, to maintain temples, to speak respectfully of divine matters. But he frames this in practical terms. Do this so things will go well for you, so the gods will be favourable, so you will prosper. Not do this because you owe it by nature of your creation, but do this because it's strategically wise. The text treats the divine relationship as transactional, humans offer service and respect, gods provide maintenance and favour. Each party receives something. It's closer to contract than to inherent obligation, even though no formal contract existed. This transactional understanding appears throughout Mesopotamian religious practice. Temple economies ran on offerings brought by human worshippers, grain, animals, beer, textiles, which supported the priests and maintained the institutions that mediated between human and divine spheres. In return, the temples performed rituals believed to keep the gods content, which maintained cosmic order, which allowed agriculture to function, which fed the population. The system had a logic to it, a functional exchange that didn't require anyone to have explicitly agreed to terms, because the exchange itself was the agreement, enacted daily through practice. But what happened when the exchange broke down? When humans fulfilled their part, worked the fields, maintained the temples, offered the sacrifices, and still the gods sent plague, drought, famine? When divine maintenance became divine assault? The Atrahasis epic suggests this is precisely what happened. The text describes human population growing, humans multiplying according to their nature, nothing in the creation accounts had included population limits. The gods designed humans to reproduce. The 14 original forms included 7 male and 7 female specifically to enable reproduction. Population growth wasn't human failure to follow instructions, it was human success at being what they'd been designed to be. They worked, they maintained temples, they served divine purposes, and they multiplied. All of this was working as intended, until Enlil decided it wasn't, until the god who administered Earth determined that humans had become too many, too loud, too present. The text uses the Akkadian word rigmu and the Sumerian huba, noise, clamour, uproar. Mainstream scholarship interprets this literally: human population had grown so large that the ambient sound of their cities, their agriculture, their daily life had become disturbing to divine beings who desired silence. Some scholars propose metaphorical readings. The noise represented disorder, loss of proper reverence, perhaps even verbal complaint or protest against the labour arrangement itself. Either way, the issue wasn't that humans failed to serve. The issue was that they succeeded too well at surviving, and this exposed the fundamental instability at the heart of the arrangement. Because if humans were obligated to serve by nature of their creation, but humans also possessed the capacity to reproduce and expand, then which obligation took priority when the two came into conflict? Were humans supposed to serve by working and maintaining temples, which required populations sufficient to do the work? Or were they supposed to serve by remaining within population limits that divine comfort required, even though no one had told them what those limits were? The texts don't record the gods ever communicating population limits to humanity. No tablet preserves the moment when Enlil or any other deity said multiply this much but no further, or work the fields but keep your numbers below this threshold. The expectation appears to have been implicit, assumed, perhaps something the gods thought obvious, but which humans, made from clay and lacking divine perspective, couldn't perceive without being told. This is where the absence of a formal agreement becomes critical. In Mesopotamian contract practice, ambiguous terms favoured the party with less power, the party who didn't write the tablet, who didn't set the conditions. Judges hearing disputes were supposed to interpret unclear obligations in favour of the weaker party, assuming that the stronger party should have been more explicit if they wanted specific compliance. But the divine-human relationship apparently didn't follow these rules. Humans were expected to intuit obligations that hadn't been specified, stay within limits that hadn't been communicated, and accept punishment when they transgressed boundaries they had no way of knowing existed. The god Enki appears throughout the Atrahasis epic as the one divine figure who finds this arrangement problematic. When Enlil sends plague, Enki instructs humans on how to appease the plague god with focused offerings, effectively helping them undermine Enlil's population reduction effort. When Enlil sends drought, Enki shows humans how to propitiate the rain god, circumventing the punishment. When Enlil sends famine, Enki provides guidance that allows humans to survive despite the agricultural collapse. Each time, Enki's intervention suggests he viewed the situation differently than Enlil did, not as human disobedience requiring correction, but as divine expectation that hadn't been fairly communicated, requiring clarification through assistance rather than punishment. Was Enki violating divine consensus by helping humans, or was he honouring an implicit obligation that came with being humanity's creator? The texts don't say explicitly, but they preserve his actions without condemnation, suggesting his interventions were within acceptable bounds even if they frustrated Enlil's plans. This implies the divine assembly itself was divided on whether humans were obligated to intuit and obey unstated population limits, or whether such limits needed to be explicitly communicated before enforcement was legitimate. The tablets from Nippur that preserve portions of the Enki and Ninmar composition include a section where, after humans are created, they're presented to the divine assembly. The gods express satisfaction with the design. Humanity appears adequate to fulfill the labour purpose, sophisticated enough to perform complex tasks, limited enough not to threaten divine supremacy. The text describes this approval, but includes no section where humans are told explicitly what their obligations are, what limits constrain them, what will trigger divine intervention. They're created, approved, and apparently released into existence, expected to figure out the terms as they went. Perhaps the gods thought this sufficient. Perhaps they assumed beings made from divine blood would naturally understand divine expectations, would inherit, along with Wei-Ilu's rationality, some instinctive sense of proper boundaries. If so, the assumption failed, because humans multiplied without apparent awareness that multiplication itself could be transgression. They worked the fields, maintained the temples, offered the sacrifices, and grew numerous. And when Enlil responded with plague, they seem to have interpreted this as natural disaster requiring appeasement rather than as punishment requiring behaviour change. When Enki showed them how to appease the plague god, they followed his instruction, the plague ended, and they resumed multiplying. This pattern, divine punishment interpreted as natural disaster, human response focused on survival rather than population reduction, repeated through each escalation. The text preserved this not as human stupidity, but as reasonable response from beings who hadn't been told they were supposed to be reducing their numbers, who had been designed to survive and multiply, and who were using the intelligence they'd been given to solve the problems they faced. From a human perspective, they were fulfilling their obligations, working, serving, maintaining temples, surviving. From Enlil's perspective, they were refusing to accept the correction he was imposing, adapting around each punishment instead of submitting to it. The absence of a clear initial agreement made both interpretations valid. Humans could legitimately claim they were doing what they'd been designed to do. Enlil could legitimately claim they were exceeding the bounds divine authority required. And the conflict escalated precisely because there was no documented contract to reference, no explicit terms to settle which interpretation was correct. Just power on one side, survival instinct on the other, and Enki in between trying to help beings whose design he'd supervised navigate expectations no one had properly explained to them. The tablets preserve this ambiguity, this fundamental uncertainty about obligation and legitimacy, authority and resistance. They sit in museums now. CBS 02168 in Philadelphia, BM 78941 in London, fragments in Paris and Istanbul and Baghdad, carrying forward a question the Sumerians apparently found important enough to keep copying. What binds created beings to their creators' expectations when those expectations were? Never explicitly stated, when the obligation is claimed after the fact, when compliance requires intuiting limits that were never communicated. Is obedience still obedience when you don't know what you're supposed to be obeying? Is refusal still refusal when you don't know there was a command? The texts don't answer. They simply show what happened when these questions became concrete rather than theoretical, when divine expectation met human expansion, when unstated obligation collided with survival instinct and the capacity to adapt. The agreement no one remembered making became the crisis no one could resolve, because you can't settle a dispute by consulting terms that were never written down, when the noise became unbearable. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York holds a fragment catalogued among their ancient Near Eastern collection, a piece of the Atrahasis epic that preserves part of the sequence describing Enlil's response to human population growth. The clay is damaged, the text incomplete, but what survives is specific about the trigger. The Akkadian reads, "The land became wide, the people became numerous, The land bellowed like wild oxen. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and said to the great gods, "The noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their uproar." This passage has generated substantial scholarly debate. The word translated as noise is rigmu in Akkadian, huber in Sumerian, terms that appear throughout Mesopotamian literature with a range of meanings. Sometimes they denote literal sound, the roar of battle, the clamour of a crowd, the tumult of a city at festival time. Sometimes they carry connotations of disorder, chaos, improper behaviour, the kind of disturbance that indicates social breakdown rather than simple volume. The question is, which meaning applies here? Was Enlil bothered by literal acoustic noise from too many human voices? Or was noise a metaphor for something else? Rebellion, impiety, loss of proper reverence toward divine authority? W.G. Lambert, whose 1969 translation with A. Millard remains the scholarly standard for the Atrahasis epic, favoured the literal interpretation. In his analysis, human population had grown beyond what the earth was designed to support, and the ambient sound of human civilization, agriculture, construction, trade, daily life had become physically disturbing to gods who desired silence. Lambert pointed to parallel passages in other texts where rigmu clearly means audible noise, and argued that the Atrahasis presents overpopulation as straightforward environmental problem, too many people making too much sound in too small a space. But other scholars, including Tikva Frye-Makensky, in her work on Mesopotamian religion, suggested the noise might be metaphorical. She noted that in administrative texts, Huber sometimes describes disorder in a city, social chaos, the breakdown of proper hierarchies. When a Sumerian king claims to have ended the Huber in his city, he means he restored order, not that he made people literally quieter. Applied to the Atrahasis, this reading suggests Enlil's complaint wasn't about volume but about humans overstepping boundaries, losing the proper deference toward divine authority, perhaps even organising in ways that made them less controllable. The text itself doesn't resolve this ambiguity. It presents Enlil's complaint without clarifying whether the problem was acoustic or behavioural. What the text does make clear is the response: systematic, escalating, and targeted at reducing human population. Enlil didn't propose educating humans to be quieter, didn't suggest teaching them proper reverence, didn't attempt communication about what boundaries they'd crossed. He proposed reduction. Fewer humans would mean less noise, whether that noise was literal sound or metaphorical disorder. The tablet in the British Museum, catalogued as BM 78941, preserves the section where Enlil convenes the Divine Assembly to address the problem. The text describes him presenting the issue to the other gods, framing it as a crisis requiring collective decision. This procedural element matters. Enlil held authority over Earth, held the tablet of destinies that governed cosmic order, but he didn't simply decree a solution. He brought the problem to assembly, suggesting even the chief administrator of earthly affairs needed consensus, or at least consultation, before implementing population control measures against the beings the gods had collectively decided to create. The assembly's initial response was to approve a plague. The text states this directly: let the egg disease break out. Not flood, not immediate extinction, but disease, a measured intervention designed to reduce numbers without eliminating humanity entirely. The choice suggests the gods viewed this as calibrated response, pressure applied to bring population down to acceptable levels while preserving enough humans to continue performing the labour they'd been designed for. You don't deploy plague if you want complete extinction. You deploy plague if you want reduction, thinning, bringing numbers back within bounds they'd exceeded. Here the text introduces a detail that complicates the entire narrative. When the plague came, when disease began killing humans in significant numbers, the god Enki intervened. He instructed humans, or perhaps one specific human, who then spread the knowledge to others, to stop making offerings to all gods and focus exclusively on Namtar, the plague god. Concentrate all worship, all sacrifice, all attention on the deity causing the problem. Essentially bribe the god who was killing them to stop killing them. And it worked. The text states that Namtar, receiving focused offerings and worship, was satisfied and withdrew the plague. Human population, which had begun declining, stabilised and began growing again. The noise that had disturbed Enlil resumed, perhaps louder than before, because humans now understood that divine threats could be negotiated with, survive through strategic response rather than submission. This sequence reveals something crucial about the cosmic structure these texts describe. Divine interventions weren't absolute. They could be undermined by other gods, offering counter-instructions. Enlil could deploy plague, but Enki could teach humans how to neutralize it. The divine assembly could make decisions, but individual gods could work around those decisions if they had the knowledge and the will to share it. The system had factions, competing interests, gods who disagreed about what should be done with humanity and were willing to act on those disagreements even if it meant undermining the expressed will of the chief administrator. Why did Enki help humans survive the plague? The text doesn't explain his motivation directly, but it consistently presents him as humanity's advocate, the god who designed them and maintained some responsibility toward them or sympathy with their situation. Perhaps he viewed Enlil's population control as unfair. Humans hadn't been told they were violating limits, hadn't been given a chance to reduce their numbers voluntarily. Or perhaps Enki simply believed the plague was excessive, that disease as punishment for multiplication was disproportionate when humans were only doing what they'd been designed to do, survive and reproduce. The tablet fragments from Sippur and Nippur that preserve portions of this sequence include another detail. After the plague ended and human population resumed growing, a period of time passed. The text marks this with formulaic language. 1200 years had not yet passed. This temporal marker appears throughout the Atrahasis epic, suggesting the narrative covers extensive time periods, perhaps centuries or even longer in divine reckoning. The point is that humanity's recovery from the plague wasn't immediate. Population rebuilt slowly, the noise gradually returned to levels that disturbed Enlil, and only after this extended period did the next intervention occur. Enlil convened the assembly again. This time he proposed drought. The text describes his instruction: let Adad withhold his rain from above, let the water from below be blocked. Adad was the storm god, controller of weather. The instruction was to stop the rain, prevent flooding from rivers, create conditions where agriculture would fail and human population would decline from famine. This was escalation, not disease which kills individuals, but environmental pressure which collapses food systems and forces entire populations to contract. Again, Enki intervened. The text describes him instructing humans, again possibly through a single intermediary who spread the knowledge, to stop all offerings to other gods and focus exclusively on Adad. Give the storm god concentrated worship, make him the centre of all religious attention, bribe him with the totality of human devotion. The pattern repeated. Adad, receiving focused offerings, was satisfied and released the rain. The drought ended. Agriculture recovered. Human population resumed growing. The frustration implicit in this sequence is palpable even through the laconic cuneiform. Enlil attempted to reduce human numbers through environmental pressure. Enki taught humans how to negotiate with the god implementing the pressure. The pressure was withdrawn. The problem from Enlil's perspective remained unsolved, and the noise, whether literal sound or metaphorical disorder, continued. After another temporal marker indicating the passage of significant time, Enlil convened the assembly a third time. The tablet BM 78943 from the British Museum preserves part of this section. Enlil proposed famine, not drought, which could be ended by propitiating Adad, but comprehensive food system collapse. The text describes this in agricultural terms. Let the fields yield little, let the grain not form properly, let Nisaba, the grain goddess, withhold her abundance. This was targeting the foundation of human survival, going after food production itself rather than the weather that enabled it. Enki's response this time was more complex. The texts preserve fragments suggesting he provided guidance on alternative food sources, ways to survive even when agriculture failed, perhaps directing humans to fish the rivers he controlled, to gather plants that still grew, to reorganize their economy around resources Enlil couldn't easily withhold. The details are fragmentary. The tablets that would have preserved this section either haven't been found or didn't survive, but the outcome is clear. Humans endured the famine. Population declined, but didn't collapse. And when conditions improved, they multiplied again. This pattern, divine pressure, human adaptation, survival, resumption of growth, repeated through each intervention. And each time, the texts suggest Enlil's frustration grew. Because the problem from his perspective wasn't that humans were weak and needed to be helped to survive. The problem was that they were too resilient, too adaptive, too capable of finding ways around the pressures meant to reduce them. The very intelligence the gods had installed in humanity to make them effective labourers, the rationality inherited from Wailu's blood, enabled them to survive attempts to reduce their population. The question of what the noise actually represented matters here. If it was literal sound, then Enlil's frustration makes sense in terms of sensory tolerance, the ambient volume of human civilization growing beyond what divine beings found comfortable. But if noise was metaphorical, if it represented human disorder or loss of proper submission to authority, then Enlil's escalating response suggests something different, not discomfort with volume, but alarm at humanity's demonstrated capacity to resist divine will, to adapt around attempts at control, to survive pressures meant to force compliance. The tablets from various sites that preserve portions of the Atrahasis epic show scribes copying this sequence across centuries. Old Babylonian tablets from the early 2nd millennium BC, Neo-Assyrian copies from the 1st millennium, all preserving the same pattern: divine intervention, Enki's counter-instruction, human survival, resumed growth, Enlil's renewed frustration. The repetition suggests this pattern mattered to the scribes, that they found something important in the cycle itself, not just in its resolution but in the escalation, the repeated failure of authority to achieve compliance through pressure, the demonstrated human capacity to adapt faster than divine control could contain. Some scholars have suggested the noise represents human prayer, that as population grew, the volume of voices calling on gods for help, making requests, demanding attention, became overwhelming. This reading has textual support. Other Mesopotamian texts mention gods being disturbed by excessive human petitions. But it introduces an irony. If humans were noisy because they were praying, asking gods for help, maintaining proper religious devotion, then punishing them for being too devout creates a double bind. Serve us properly, but not too enthusiastically. Pray, but don't pray too much. Multiply, but don't become too numerous. Follow the obligations we built into you, but don't follow them so successfully that you become disturbing. The text preserves no indication that Enlil recognized this contradiction. From his perspective, the problem was straightforward: too many humans making too much disturbance. The solution was equally straightforward: reduce the population. That the population kept finding ways to avoid reduction, that another god kept helping them survive the reduction attempts, that the very capacities installed in humans to make them useful also made them difficult to reduce. These complications apparently didn't alter Enlil's assessment. The noise needed to end. If plague, drought and famine wouldn't end it, then something more comprehensive would be required. The tablets show Enlil reaching this conclusion, not immediately, but through a process. 3 interventions, 3 failures, 3 cycles of reduction attempt and human recovery. The escalation was methodical, each intervention more severe than the last, each one targeting a different vulnerability in human survival systems. Only after this sequence played out, only after it became clear that humans could adapt around any partial pressure, did Enlil propose the final solution the texts move toward. Not reduction, but elimination. Not pressure, but erasure. Not plague or famine, but water covering everything until the noise stopped permanently. The fragments sit in museums now. New York, London, Philadelphia, Paris, pieces of baked clay preserving this escalation. The noise that bothered Enlil, whether sound or disorder or resilience itself, is still debated by scholars translating the Akkadian and Sumerian. But what's not debated is the sequence: human population growth, divine intervention, Enki's assistance, human survival, resumed growth, escalated intervention. The cycle preserved across multiple tablets, copied by multiple scribes, transmitted across centuries as if the pattern itself was the message, that authority, even divine authority, could find itself unable to control populations who possess the intelligence to adapt, the will to survive, and access to knowledge that undermined enforcement. When does noise become unbearable? When volume reaches intolerable levels? Or when the noise demonstrates that the ones making it can't be easily silenced, that they've learned to work around every pressure applied, that they possess resources, whether Enki's guidance or their own inherited rationality, that enable them to persist despite divine preference, that they diminish? The tablets preserve the question without resolving it, leaving us to hear the echo of that ancient noise, whatever it was, across 3,700 years of silence. The escalation protocol. There's a pattern in the Atrahasis epic that reads less like mythology and more like case documentation, a systematic record of interventions attempted, results observed, strategies adjusted. The tablet fragments that preserve this sequence show Enlil approaching the human population problem not with immediate overwhelming force, but with calibrated pressure, each intervention targeting a different vulnerability, each one designed to achieve reduction, while preserving enough human capacity to continue performing the labour they'd been created for. This wasn't divine rage expressed through instant annihilation. It was administrative problem solving, methodical and escalating, testing what level of pressure would achieve the desired outcome. The first intervention was plague. The text preserved on BM 78941 and related fragments describes this with procedural specificity. Enlil brought the problem to the divine assembly. Human noise had become intolerable. The assembly approved his proposal to deploy Namtar, the plague god, against the human population. The text doesn't describe the mechanism of the plague, whether it was a specific disease or a general category of illness, but it describes the effect. Humans began dying in significant numbers. Population, which had been growing, started to contract. The noise that disturbed Enlil began to diminish. Then Enki intervened. The tablets preserve his counter-instruction: humans should cease making offerings to all gods except Namtar. Concentrate worship, sacrifice, attention entirely on the deity causing the plague. The strategy was essentially bribery: overwhelm Namtar with devotion until he was satisfied and withdrew the disease. And according to the text, this worked. Namtar, receiving concentrated worship, was appeased. The plague ended. Human population stabilized and began recovering. What's significant here is not just that Enki helped humans survive, but how he helped them. He didn't cure the disease through divine intervention, didn't use his own power to counter Namtar's plague directly. Instead, he provided information, knowledge about how divine psychology worked, insight into what would motivate a god to withdraw punishment. He taught humans to exploit the system's own logic. Gods respond to worship. Concentrated devotion influences divine behaviour. Focused offerings can redirect divine action. This was teaching humans how to negotiate with the powers controlling their survival, giving them tools to influence outcomes rather than simply enduring whatever was imposed on them. The implications of this strategy would have been clear to anyone in Mesopotamian society. Temple systems throughout the ancient Near East ran on offerings. Priests taught that proper worship ensured divine favour, that neglecting the gods brought disaster. Enki's instruction weaponized this transactional understanding, showed humans they could use it not just to maintain divine goodwill generally, but to solve specific problems. to end specific threats, to manipulate the system that was supposed to be manipulating them. He essentially taught them that divine authority operated according to rules, and rules could be worked with, adapted to, turned to human advantage. From Enlil's perspective, this must have been profoundly frustrating. He'd identified a problem, human overpopulation. He'd proposed a solution, reduce numbers through disease. The Divine Assembly had approved the plan. The intervention was deployed successfully, and then another god undermined the entire effort by giving humans the knowledge they needed to neutralize it. The plague that should have thinned human numbers until the noise became tolerable instead ended prematurely, leaving the population trajectory essentially unchanged. The problem remained unsolved. The text marks time passing 1200 years according to the formulaic language the Atrahasis uses to indicate extended periods. Then the noise resumed, or perhaps never really stopped. Enlil convened the assembly again. This time he proposed drought. The tablet fragments from Nippur that preserve this section describe the instruction. Adad the storm god should withhold rain from above, water should be blocked from below. This was targeting the environmental systems human agriculture depended on, not killing humans directly through disease, but cutting off the water that enabled food production, forcing population reduction through resource scarcity rather than pathogen. Drought has different characteristics than plague. Disease can be localized, can affect some populations while sparing others, can be interpreted as natural misfortune requiring ritual response. Drought is systematic, affects entire regions, creates undeniable pressure on food systems. It should have been harder to counter than plague. But again, Enki intervened, and again his strategy was to teach humans how to redirect divine action through concentrated worship. This time the target was Adad. Stop offering to all other gods, focus everything on the storm deity, overwhelm him with devotion until he released the rain. The pattern repeated. Adad, receiving focused worship, provided rain. The drought ended. Agriculture recovered. Human population resumed growing, and Enlil's frustration, though the text doesn't explicitly describe his emotional state, becomes evident through the escalation itself. If one method fails, try another. If drought doesn't work, try something that can't be ended by negotiating with a single god. After another period of time, again marked by the formulaic 1200 years, Enlil convened the assembly a third time. The proposal now was famine, but not famine caused by drought. The tablet BM 78943 preserves the language, let the fields fail to produce even when watered, let grain not form properly, let the goddess Nisaba withhold the abundance of the earth itself. This was going after agricultural fertility directly, targeting the biological processes of plant growth rather than the environmental conditions that supported them. Rain could fall, rivers could flow, but the crops wouldn't produce food sufficient to sustain population at current levels. This intervention was more sophisticated than the previous two. It couldn't be countered by negotiating with a single god because it involved the fundamental fertility of the earth, systems too complex and distributed to fix through concentrated worship at one deity. The text suggests this famine lasted longer, achieved more substantial population reduction than plague or drought had managed. Humans suffered, numbers declined, and this time there wasn't a simple ritual solution that could end the pressure. But humans adapted anyway. The fragmentary tablets that preserve this section don't give us the complete picture of how, but they suggest Enki again provided guidance, this time perhaps directing humans to alternative food sources, to resources that didn't depend on agriculture, to ways of surviving even when grain failed. The rivers Enki controlled still had fish. Wild plants still grew in areas outside cultivated fields. Human capacity for tool use, for organisation, for finding and exploiting marginal resources could be directed towards survival even in conditions where conventional agriculture collapsed. The Metropolitan Museum fragment that describes part of this sequence includes language about humans eating roots, about mothers hiding food from children, about the desperation of famine conditions. The text doesn't glorify human survival during this period. It describes suffering, describes population decline, describes social breakdown under extreme pressure, but it also describes endurance. Humans didn't go extinct. They found ways to persist, to organise around the crisis, to survive at reduced numbers until conditions improved, or until they adapted to functioning within the new constraints. This is where the text's procedural quality becomes most apparent. Each intervention followed a pattern: problem identified, solution proposed, assembly approval, implementation, initial success, Enki's counter-intervention, human adaptation, resumed growth, renewed divine frustration. The cycle repeated with variations, each iteration teaching both gods and humans something about the nature of the conflict. Gods learned that humans were more resilient than expected, that reducing their population was more difficult than it should have been, that Enki would continue undermining enforcement efforts. Humans learned that divine authority could be negotiated with, that survival was possible even under extreme pressure, that knowledge, whether from Enki or their own experience, could counter superior power. Some scholars reading the Atrahasis have suggested the plague, drought, famine sequence represents actual historical memory of recurring crises in ancient Mesopotamia. The region experienced periodic epidemics, had regular droughts when rainfall failed, suffered famines when agriculture collapsed. Perhaps the text is encoding in mythological language the human experience of navigating recurring disasters, preserving the memory that populations did survive these crises, that strategies for endurance were developed and transmitted, that each crisis taught lessons that helped survival in thee. Next one. But the text presents these events not as natural disasters, but as intentional interventions, divinely administered pressures designed to reduce human population. The distinction matters because it frames survival not as luck or natural resilience, but as resistance to imposed control. When plague came, humans didn't just endure it, they learned to manipulate the divine system to end it. When drought came, they adapted the same strategy to different circumstances. When famine came, and the simple strategies didn't work, they found more complex adaptations. Each survival was an act of refusing the outcome divine authority intended, using intelligence and knowledge to circumvent pressure meant to force compliance. The instructions of Shuruppak, that pre-flood wisdom text preserved on tablets, catalogued in the CD Lai as literary 000782, includes advice about surviving hard times. Shuruppak tells his son to store food against famine, to maintain good relations with neighbours for mutual support, to be resourceful when resources are scarce. The text doesn't frame this as resistance to divine will, it presents it as practical wisdom, the kind of knowledge necessary for navigating an uncertain world. But in the context of the Atrahasis sequence, this practical wisdom becomes the means by which humans survived pressures specifically designed to reduce them. The capacity to plan, to cooperate, to adapt, these were the tools that enabled population recovery after each intervention. From Enlil's perspective, the problem was becoming more fundamental with each iteration. It wasn't just that human population was too large, it was that human population couldn't be easily reduced to acceptable size, that every intervention designed to thin their numbers either failed completely or achieved only temporary reduction before numbers rebounded. The issue wasn't human weakness requiring divine maintenance, it was human resilience resisting divine control. And behind that resilience was another god, Enki, who kept providing the knowledge and assistance that made survival possible when it should have been impossible. The text preserves no record of direct confrontation between Enlil and Enki during this sequence. No scene where Enlil accuses Enki of sabotage, no moment where the divine assembly debates whether Enki's assistance to humans violates divine consensus. But the pattern itself implies conflict. One god repeatedly trying to reduce human population, another god repeatedly helping humans avoid reduction. The silence around this conflict in the surviving tablets might indicate it was too sensitive to record explicitly, or might simply reflect gaps in the preserved text. Either way, the actions speak clearly enough. Enlil and Enki were working at cross purposes, pursuing incompatible goals, and humans were both the subject and the beneficiary of their disagreement. After 3 iterations of this cycle, plague, drought, famine, each one ending in resumed human population growth, the text shows Enlil reaching a conclusion. The problem couldn't be solved through partial measures. Targeted interventions failed because they could be adapted to, negotiated around, survived through intelligence and assistance. If human population was to be reduced to levels Enlil found tolerable, the intervention would need to be comprehensive, absolute, something that couldn't be circumvented through ritual or resourcefulness or divine assistance. It would need to be total. The tablets don't preserve the moment of this decision as sudden revelation. Instead, they show it emerging through the failed sequence, through the evidence that accumulated with each unsuccessful intervention. Namtar's plague didn't work. Adad's drought didn't work. Nisaba's famine worked partially, but not permanently. The pattern made the conclusion obvious. Anything less than total elimination would eventually be adapted to, survived, overcome. Human resilience, combined with Enki's assistance, created a situation where half measures achieved nothing lasting. The noise would return. The population would recover. The problem would persist. So Enlil, according to the text, convened the assembly one final time with a different kind of proposal. Not reduction, elimination, not pressure applied to thin numbers, erasure comprehensive enough that adaptation would be impossible, survival foreclosed, the noise ended permanent, water covering everything, rising higher than mountains, sustained long enough that nothing living could endure it, a flood that would return the earth to the silence that existed before humanity was created, solving the population problem by removing the population entirely. The tablets that preserve this sequence, BM 78941, BM 78943, the Metropolitan Museum fragment, the Nippur pieces, the Sippar tablets, sit in museums now as fragments of what was once a complete narrative. The gaps in the text mirror the gaps in our understanding. We have the structure of the escalation, the pattern of intervention and survival, but we lack many details about how humans organise their survival, what exactly Enki told them, how the Divine Assembly debated these questions. What survives is enough to show that the escalation followed a logic, that Enlil approached the problem systematically, that each intervention was calibrated based on the previous one's failure, and that by the end of the sequence, the conclusion was clear: human population couldn't be controlled through pressure. It could only be ended through erasure, or so Enlil believed. The text moves toward the flood decision, with the weight of failed alternatives behind it. 3 attempts at population reduction, 3 adaptations that circumvented divine intention, 3 cycles of pressure applied, and pressure survived. The escalation protocol had been followed, the graduated interventions had been tested, and humanity had demonstrated, through their resilience and Enki's assistance, that they were more difficult to control than the gods who created them had anticipated. The question remaining was whether they were also more difficult to eliminate, the wisdom that undermined authority. The tablets don't explain why Enki chose to help humans survive the interventions Enlil deployed against them. They simply record that he did, repeatedly and systematically, providing counter-instructions that undermined divine consensus and enabled human population to recover from each crisis. This pattern of assistance raises questions the texts themselves never answer directly. Was Enki obligated to help the beings he'd designed? Did he view Enlil's interventions as unjust? Or was something more complex happening? A factional conflict among gods playing out through their treatment of the mortal population caught between them. What the tablets do preserve is the method of Enki's assistance. He didn't use direct divine power to counter the interventions. He didn't cure plague with his own magic, didn't summon rain to end drought, didn't make crops grow during famine. Instead, he provided information. He taught humans how the divine system worked, showed them which rituals would influence which gods, revealed the transactional nature of the relationship between worship and divine favour. He made humans aware that they weren't helpless recipients of whatever the gods imposed, that they had leverage, small but real, in the form of focused devotion that could redirect divine attention and alter divine behaviour. This was dangerous knowledge. Mesopotamian religious practice assumed asymmetry between human and divine spheres. Humans served, gods commanded. Humans offered, gods received. Humans petitioned, gods decided. The transactional element existed. Temples taught that proper worship brought divine favour, but it was supposed to be mediated by priests, channeled through institutions, controlled by those who understood the proper procedures. Enki bypassed all of this. He went directly to humans, or to specific humans who could spread the knowledge, and told them how to manipulate the system for their own survival. The text describes Enki instructing someone called Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise in Akkadian. Whether this was a single individual or a title for someone who served as intermediary between Enki and the broader human population, the tablets don't clarify. What they show is Enki speaking to this figure, providing specific guidance: when plague comes, cease all offerings to other gods and concentrate everything on Namtar. Make him the focus of all worship. Overwhelm him with attention until he's satisfied and withdraws the disease. This instruction revealed something the gods perhaps didn't want humans to know, that divine beings responded to incentives, that concentrated worship had power over individual deities, that the system could be gamed by those who understood its mechanics. It wasn't that gods were weak or easily controlled, but they operated according to patterns, responded to certain stimuli, could be influenced through strategic action. Enki was teaching humans to see the divine system as a system, something with rules and vulnerabilities rather than inscrutable authority that must be accepted without question. When the strategy worked, when Namtar withdrew the plague in response to focused worship, it validated Enki's instruction. Humans learned that divine authority wasn't monolithic, that individual gods could be approached and influenced, that survival wasn't dependent solely on submitting to whatever pressure was applied. They learned, in effect, that they had agency within a system that was supposed to deny them agency, that knowledge could substitute for power when applied strategically. The instructions of Shurupak, that compilation of wisdom preserved on tablets from pre-flood Sumerian cities, includes advice that takes on new meaning in this context. Shurupak tells his son Ziusudra, who would later become the flood survivor, to maintain good relationships with the gods through proper offerings, but also to be wise about when and how to approach divine authority. The text counsels strategic thinking about worship. Don't neglect the gods, but be thoughtful about which gods receive attention when. This sounds like practical religious advice, but it's also the kind of strategic thinking about divine relationships that Enki's instructions exemplified on a larger scale. Was Shurupak's advice based on knowledge transmitted through Enki's earlier interventions? Did human wisdom literature preserve and transmit the understanding that divine authority could be negotiated with, that strategic worship could influence outcomes, that humans weren't entirely powerless in their relationships with gods? The text doesn't say explicitly, but the instructions of Shurupak come from the same cultural context as the Atrahasis epic, were preserved by the same scribal traditions, addressed the same questions about how humans should navigate a world where gods held overwhelming but not absolute power. When drought came, and Enki again provided instruction, this time to concentrate worship on Adad, the storm god, the pattern reinforced what plague had taught. Divine interventions could be countered through strategic worship. Gods responded to focused attention. The system had vulnerabilities that knowledge could exploit, and Enki was willing to share that knowledge, even when doing so undermined the efforts of Enlil, the chief administrator of earthly affairs, to solve what he considered a legitimate problem requiring divine intervention. This creates a question about divine authority structure. Enlil held the Tablet of Destinies, the cosmic authority that governed order and fate. He administered the earth, held responsibility for maintaining proper conditions. When he identified human overpopulation as a problem and proposed interventions to address it, the Divine Assembly approved his proposals. He was acting within his authority, following proper procedures, implementing solutions that divine consensus had authorized. Yet Enki could undermine these interventions without apparently facing consequences, without being called before the assembly to explain why he was sabotaging decisions the gods had collectively made. The texts never show Enlil confronting Enki directly about this assistance to humans. They don't preserve any scene where the divine assembly debates whether Enki's actions violate divine law or cosmic order. This absence might indicate such confrontations happened but weren't recorded, or it might suggest Enki was also operating within his authority, that his role as creator of humanity gave him rights or responsibilities that allowed him to assist the beings he designed, even when that assistance conflicted with other gods' decisions. The composition Enki and Ninmah, preserved partially on tablets in the Louvre Museum, catalogued as AO 7036, and in the Penn Museum's collection as CBS 02168, describes Enki as humanity's designer, the god who devised the method for creating humans from clay and divine blood. The text presents him as taking pride in his creation, defending it when Ninmah challenges various aspects of the design. If Enki viewed humanity as his work, his creation, then perhaps he considered himself responsible for their welfare in ways other gods weren't. Perhaps assisting them to survive threats was, from his perspective, fulfilling an obligation that came with being their maker. But the assistance Enki provided went beyond maintenance or protection. He was actively teaching humans to manipulate the divine system, to undermine decisions other gods had made, to resist through knowledge what they couldn't resist through power. This was educational intervention of a specific type, not teaching humans to farm more efficiently or build better tools, but teaching them to recognize and exploit the structures of authority itself. He was creating informed subjects where the system seemed to require compliant ones, empowering humans with understanding that made them less controllable, even as it made them more capable of surviving the pressures applied to control them. The third intervention, the famine that targeted agricultural fertility itself, apparently required different guidance from Enki, because the simple strategy of concentrating worship on a single god wouldn't work. The tablets that would have preserved Enki's instruction during this period are fragmentary or missing, but the outcome suggests he provided more complex assistance, perhaps guidance on alternative food sources, on fishing the rivers he controlled, on gathering wild plants, on reorganizing human economy to function during extended agricultural collapse. This would have been practical knowledge rather than ritual instruction, but it served the same purpose, enabling humans to survive pressure meant to reduce them. Some scholars interpreting the Atrahasis have suggested Enki's assistance represents a divine faction that viewed human population growth differently than Enlil did. Perhaps Enki didn't consider the noise a problem requiring intervention. Perhaps he saw human population expansion as success rather than failure, beings fulfilling their design by surviving and reproducing rather than exceeding their intended bounds. If so, His assistance wasn't sabotage of legitimate authority, but defence of legitimate outcomes against interventions he considered unjustified. The text doesn't confirm this reading, but it doesn't contradict it either. What the tablets preserve is the pattern without fully explaining the motivation. Enlil identifies problem and proposes intervention, assembly approves, implementation begins, Enki provides counter-instruction, humans survive, population recovers, Enlil's intervention fails to achieve its purpose. The repetition of this pattern suggests it wasn't accident or isolated incident, but systematic opposition, two gods pursuing incompatible goals, with human survival hanging on the outcome of their conflict. There's another element to Enki's assistance that the texts hint at but don't fully develop. He wasn't just helping humans survive, he was teaching them that survival was possible, that divine pressure could be resisted, that they weren't obligated to accept whatever fate divine authority imposed. This was psychological instruction as much as practical. Before Enki's interventions, when plague came, humans might have interpreted it as inevitable punishment, something to be endured rather than countered. Enki taught them to see it differently, as a problem that could be solved, a pressure that could be redirected, a crisis that intelligence could navigate. This shift in perspective might have been more dangerous to divine authority than the specific survival strategies Enki taught, because once humans understood, they could influence outcomes through knowledge and strategic action. Once they'd survived multiple crises by applying Enki's instruction, they learnt something fundamental. They weren't entirely powerless. They depended on divine maintenance of cosmic systems, yes, but they also had leverage, had agency, had capacity to affect their own survival in ways that divine authority couldn't completely control. The knowledge Enki provided wasn't just about which gods to worship when. It was about humans being active participants in their own fate rather than passive recipients of divine will. The wisdom literature that survives from ancient Mesopotamia consistently emphasizes human responsibility to navigate a complex world wisely. The instructions of Shurupak, the later councils of wisdom, the various proverb collections preserved on tablets throughout the region, all of them teach that humans must think strategically, must understand how systems work, must use knowledge to improve their outcomes within constraints they can't eliminate. This tradition of wisdom literature might preserve, in generalized form, the specific lesson Enki taught during the crisis the Atrahasis describes, that knowledge enables survival, that understanding systems allows influence over them, that wisdom can substitute for power when applied correctly. Was Enki training humans to be wise, or training them to be resistant? Perhaps the question assumes a distinction the texts don't make. In the worldview these tablets preserve, wisdom was resistance, not in the sense of violent opposition, but in the sense of refusing to accept imposed outcomes when knowledge offered alternatives. Being wise meant seeing systems clearly enough to find leverage within them, understanding divine behaviour well enough to influence it, recognising that authority, even divine authority, operated according to patterns that could be worked with rather than simply submitted to. The tablets show Enlil's growing frustration, not just with human population, but with their capacity to survive his interventions. And behind that capacity was Enki's willingness to share knowledge that made survival possible. By the time Enlil proposed the flood as final solution, he wasn't just trying to solve the overpopulation problem. He was trying to eliminate beings who had demonstrated through 3 crisis cycles that they could adapt, survive, and recover from whatever pressures were applied to reduce them. The knowledge Enki shared had made humans more resilient than their design specifications suggested they should be. And that resilience had become the problem itself. Not that humans were too numerous, but that they'd learned they didn't have to accept reduction when divine authority demanded it. The fragments preserved in London and Philadelphia and Paris carry this story forward without resolving its central ambiguity. Was Enki right to help humans survive? Or was he undermining legitimate authority for reasons the texts never make clear? The question sits there in the cuneiform pressed into clay 700 years ago, preserved through library fires and archaeological excavations and museum storage, waiting for anyone reading to decide, when authority imposes pressure on populations who possess the knowledge to resist it. Whose obligation takes priority? The obligation of the powerful to maintain order as they define it, or the obligation of the knowledgeable to help the vulnerable survive? The Assembly's final decision. The British Museum tablet BM 78941 preserves a section of the Atrahasis epic that describes a council meeting different in character from the previous assemblies. Enlil convened the gods again, but this time the text suggests something had shifted. The proposal wasn't another calibrated intervention, not a fourth attempt at reduction through disease or environmental pressure. What Enlil brought to the assembly was a conclusion drawn from accumulated evidence. Partial measures had failed, human population could not be controlled through conventional means, and the only solution remaining was comprehensive elimination. The text describes Enlil binding the gods by oath. This procedural detail is specific and unusual. In the previous assemblies, when Enlil proposed plague, drought and famine, the text records discussion and approval but doesn't mention oaths. Now, before presenting his final proposal, Enlil required the assembled gods to swear they would maintain the decision, that they wouldn't undermine the intervention the way previous ones had been undermined. The oath binding suggests Enlil understood that divine consensus on this matter was fragile, that some gods, Enki specifically, had been working against the agreed upon solutions, and that preventing another circumvention required formal commitment before the plan was even revealed. The text records the oath in formulaic language. Let all of us swear an oath about the deluge. The gods agreed, bound themselves to the decision collectively before knowing exactly what the decision entailed. This sequence, oath first, details after, appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian texts, when one party anticipates resistance and wants to secure commitment before revealing something controversial. Enlil was apparently preparing for objection, particularly from Enki, and wanted the divine assembly locked into supporting the flood before debate could undermine consensus. Then Enlil described the plan. Not plague that could be ended by propitiating Namtar, not drought that could be resolved by offering to Adad, not famine that humans could survive through alternative resources, water, comprehensive and sustained, covering the earth until nothing living remained. The text uses the Akkadian word abubu, flood, deluge, a term that carries connotations of overwhelming force and complete inundation. This wasn't seasonal flooding that irrigated fields and made agriculture possible. This was destructive water, rising beyond control, eliminating rather than nourishing. The assembly approved. The text states this simply, without recording debate or dissent. The gods agreed to the flood, bound by the oath they'd already sworn. But the next section preserved on the tablets reveals that agreement wasn't unanimous in practice, even if it was unanimous in procedure. Because Enki, though he'd sworn the oath with the other gods, immediately began finding ways to circumvent it without technically violating the commitment he'd made. The text describes Enki's dilemma explicitly. He had sworn not to reveal the god's decision to humanity. The oath bound him to silence about the coming flood. But the oath didn't prevent him from speaking to other entities, walls, reeds, structures that weren't human but could be overheard by humans if they happened to be listening. This is where the Atrahasis epic preserves one of its most remarkable passages. Enki went to the reed wall of a house where Atrahasis slept, and he spoke to the wall itself, describing the flood decision, explaining that a boat should be built, specifying the dimensions and design, instructing that life should be preserved by bringing specimens aboard. The text records Enki's words: reed wall, 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 reed wall, hear, wall, understand. Man of Shuruppak, son of Ubartutu, demolish your house, build a boat, abandon wealth, seek life, spurn property, save living things, bring living seed of all kinds into the boat. The instruction was comprehensive: not just survive yourself, but preserve life, bring specimens, ensure continuity beyond the erasure the flood was designed to achieve. This wasn't Enki violating his oath through ignorance or accident. The text presents it as calculated circumvention, finding the technical loophole that allowed him to warn humanity without directly breaking the commitment he'd made to the assembly. He spoke to the wall, not to the man, that the man was there to hear, that the warning reached its intended recipient, that the instruction was understood and could be acted upon. These were consequences of Enki's action, but not technically violations of the oath itself. Why this particular man? The tablets identify him as Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise one who had received Enki's instructions during the previous crises, the intermediary through whom Enki had taught humans to survive plague and drought and famine. The name appears to be descriptive rather than simply identificatory. This was someone who had demonstrated capacity to understand and implement complex instructions, who had successfully guided human survival through previous divine interventions, who was wise enough to be trusted with the knowledge that could preserve human existence through the final intervention. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 10673 in the Penn Museum's collection, offers a Sumerian parallel to this scene. In that version, the man warned is called Ziusudra, and the deity warning him is also Enki, though some fragments suggest the god Anu might have been involved as well. The mechanism is similar. Ziusudra receives divine instruction about the coming flood, is told to build a vessel, is given dimensions and specifications. The text describes him as a pious king, someone who had maintained proper relationship with the gods, whose reverence was noted and valued. The different names, Atrahasis in the Akkadian tradition, Ziusudra in the Sumerian, Utnapishtim in later Babylonian texts like Gilgamesh Tablet C, suggest this figure was significant enough that multiple cultures preserved his story while adapting the details to their own contexts. What remains consistent across versions is that he was warned, that he received specific instruction about building a survival vessel, and that he was chosen because he possessed qualities that made him worth preserving even when the rest of humanity was marked for elimination. The Assembly's oath and Enki's circumvention reveal something crucial about divine authority as these texts understood it. The gods could achieve consensus, could bind themselves to collective decisions, could establish formal procedures that all agreed to follow. But consensus didn't eliminate factional disagreement. Oaths didn't prevent creative interpretation, and formal commitment didn't guarantee unified implementation. Enki found a way to honour the letter of his oath while violating its spirit, to technically maintain his commitment while undermining the purpose the commitment was meant to serve. This suggests divine authority in the Mesopotamian worldview wasn't absolute even among the gods themselves. They had procedures, required consensus for major decisions, bound each other through oaths when trust was insufficient. But these mechanisms were imperfect. They could constrain action without preventing circumvention, could establish formal agreement without ensuring genuine compliance. The Divine Assembly functioned like human assemblies, through negotiation, compromise, formal procedures that everyone agreed to, but not everyone supported, decisions that could be undermined by those with sufficient knowledge and motivation to work around them. The tablet fragments that preserve the assembly scene include another detail. After Enlil secured the oath and described the flood plan, he assigned responsibility for implementation to various gods. Adad would provide the rain. Shulat and Hanish would remove the irrigation dikes. Eragel would tear out the mooring poles that held structures in place. The distribution of tasks suggests the flood wasn't a simple natural disaster, but a coordinated divine action requiring multiple deities working together to create comprehensive inundation. This was systematic elimination, carefully planned and collectively executed, not rage expressed through random destruction. But if implementation required multiple gods working in coordination, then the system had vulnerabilities. Any god who opposed the plan couldn't stop it alone. The coordination meant that individual refusal wouldn't prevent the flood. But individual gods could undermine it in other ways, could warn potential survivors, could provide knowledge that enabled preservation even as elimination proceeded. Enki couldn't prevent the flood, but he could ensure the flood didn't achieve its total purpose, that life would continue beyond the erasure, that humanity would survive in reduced form even after the intervention designed to eliminate them completely. The Gilgamesh epic, Tablet C, catalogued in the British Museum as K3375, preserves what appears to be a later version of the same flood narrative. In that telling, Utnapishtim, the Babylonian name for the flood survivor, describes the assembly decision in similar terms. The gods decided on destruction, Enlil demanded comprehensive elimination, but Ea, the Akkadian form of Enki, warned one man by speaking to the wall of his house. The parallel between texts separated by centuries suggests this element was considered important enough to preserve carefully, that even when divine consensus existed, even when oaths were sworn, even when systematic elimination was planned and implemented, knowledge could circumvent authority. Individual divine action could undermine collective decisions, and preservation could occur within the very process designed to achieve erasure. Why did the assembly approve Enlil's flood proposal when the previous interventions had failed? The text doesn't preserve extended debate, doesn't show gods arguing about whether comprehensive elimination was justified or excessive, but the progression suggests the answer, because partial measures demonstrably didn't work. 3 interventions, 3 survivals, 3 resumptions of the population growth that Enlil identified as intolerable. The evidence was clear that humans, with Enki's assistance, could adapt to any pressure that left them alive. Therefore, the only solution that could achieve the desired outcome was one that left no survivors, no opportunity for adaptation, no possibility that knowledge could enable circumvention. The logic was impeccable, assuming elimination was an acceptable solution, and apparently the assembly agreed it was acceptable, or at least that no better alternative existed. They bound themselves by oath to support the flood, assigned implementation responsibilities, and prepared to execute the comprehensive erasure of human population from the earth. That Enki immediately began circumventing this decision suggests not all gods agreed it was acceptable, but objection didn't prevent consensus. The system moved forward toward implementation, even though at least one god was already working to undermine it. The tablets preserve this sequence without moral commentary. They don't tell us the gods were wrong to attempt elimination, don't tell us Enki was right to circumvent their decision. They simply show what happened. Assembly meeting, oath binding, flood decision, implementation assignment, Enki's warning to the wall, Atrahasis receiving instruction that would enable survival. The procedural detail continues through both the decision and its undermining, as if the text were documenting the mechanics of how authority makes decisions, and how those decisions can be resisted by those with knowledge and will to resist them. Modern readers encountering this sequence often see Enki as hero, the god who saved humanity from unjust destruction, but the texts don't frame it that way. They present Enlil's frustration with human population as legitimate concern within his administrative responsibilities. They show the assembly following proper procedures before authorizing elimination. They describe Enki's circumvention as clever, but don't explicitly celebrate it as righteous. The narrative sits in that ambiguous space where both sides have legitimate perspectives, where divine authority was trying to solve a real problem, and divine dissent was preserving something valuable, and the conflict between them couldn't be resolved through procedure or consensus but only through the test of implementation itself. The assembly made its decision. Enki undermined it. The flood would come as planned, but one man would survive, and with him enough life to ensure humanity continued beyond the erasure. The question remaining was what would happen after, whether the gods would accept this circumvention, whether Enlil would find the reduced post-flood population tolerable, whether the relationship between divine authority and human population could be restructured in ways that prevented the same crisis from recurring. The tablets moved toward the flood itself with both inevitability and uncertainty. The elimination would happen, but preservation was already underway, and neither outcome would be complete. The fragments sit in museums now, London, Philadelphia, Paris, preserving this moment when divine consensus decided on comprehensive elimination, and divine dissent ensured comprehensive elimination would fail. The Assembly's final decision was both absolute and circumventable, both formally binding and practically undermined, both the end of humanity as it existed and the beginning of humanity as it would continue. The text preserved the contradiction without resolving it, leaving us to wonder whether systems of authority can ever achieve the outcomes they formally decide upon when knowledge exists to circumvent them, when dissent has the will to undermine them, when the ones marked for elimination possess the wisdom to survive, despite consensus that they shouldn't. One man who listened. The Penn Museum tablet CBS 10673, excavated from Nippur in the early 20th century, preserves part of the Sumerian flood account known as the Eridu Genesis. The fragment is damaged, the lower portion missing, but what survives describes a king named Ziusudra receiving divine warning about the coming deluge. The text presents him as distinguished by a specific quality. He listened. Not that he was stronger than other humans, or wealthier, or more powerful. The tablets emphasize that he was attentive, that when divine instruction came, however it came, he heard it, understood it, and acted on it. This quality of attention matters because it suggests Enki's warning through the reed wall wasn't the only factor determining who survived. The warning had to reach someone capable of receiving it, someone who would take seriously an instruction that must have seemed impossible. Abandon your house, your possessions, your normal life, and build a vessel to survive a flood more comprehensive than anything experienced before. The text doesn't describe Ziusudra as someone naturally inclined to trust mysterious voices speaking through walls. It describes him as someone who had developed the capacity to recognize divine communication when it occurred, even in unconventional forms, and to respond appropriately even when the instruction contradicted normal logic. The Atrahasis epic uses a different name for this figure, Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise in Akkadian, but describes the same essential characteristic. This was someone who had previously received Enki's guidance during the plague, drought, and famine cycles. He had learned to recognize when divine assistance was being offered, had developed trust in Enki's instruction through seeing it work during earlier crises. When Enki spoke to the reed wall about building a boat, Atrahasis didn't dismiss it as delusion or misunderstanding. He recognized the pattern from previous interventions, Enki providing knowledge that enabled survival, offering instruction that seemed strange but proved effective when implemented. The text preserved on BM 78941 describes Atrahasis' response to the warning. He asked questions. He sought clarification. The exchange between Enki and Atrahasis reads like technical consultation, with Atrahasis requesting specifications and Enki providing them. How large should the boat be? What materials should be used? What shape would provide stability? How should the interior be divided to accommodate the living? Things that needed preservation. The questions suggest Atrahasis was treating this as practical problem requiring practical solution, not as mystical revelation requiring faith without understanding. He was approaching survival systematically, gathering information needed to implement the instruction effectively. Enki's responses were detailed. The boat should be roofed over, should have a square design according to some versions or circular according to others, the different accounts preserve different specifications, suggesting either textual variation or perhaps multiple traditions about what kind of vessel was built. The dimensions were specific, so many cubits in length and width and height, walls of specific thickness, internal divisions creating multiple decks or compartments. The text describes waterproofing procedures, pitch inside and out, bitumen applied to seal the joints, materials layered to prevent water penetration. These weren't vague, mystical instructions. They were engineering specifications for a vessel designed to remain afloat and watertight during sustained flooding. The level of technical detail preserved in the texts suggests the scribes considered these specifications important. They weren't just documenting that a boat was built, they were recording how it was built, preserving the knowledge that enabled survival. This parallels Enki's earlier interventions, providing not just the idea of survival, but the specific information needed to achieve it. Knowledge as tool, instruction as weapon against imposed elimination, wisdom as the resource that enables those lacking power to circumvent those who hold authority. Atrahasis began building. The text describes this process taking significant time, mentions him gathering materials, recruiting workers to help with construction, organising resources toward an outcome his neighbours apparently couldn't see the need for. Other fragmentary accounts suggest he faced mockery or scepticism from those who didn't understand why anyone would build a massive boat far from navigable water, why someone would abandon productive labour to prepare for a disaster that had no precedent in human experience. But Atrahasis continued working, trusting the instruction he'd received, implementing the specifications Enki provided. This element of the narrative, one man building while others went about normal life, one person acting on information others didn't have or didn't credit, appears consistently across the different versions. The Eridu Genesis describes Yasudra as a king who received the warning while performing religious duties, someone whose position perhaps gave him resources to implement the large-scale construction the boat required. The Gilgamesh Tablet C version describes Utnapishtim telling his neighbours he was building a boat because he'd offended Enlil and needed to relocate to Enki's domain in the Apsu, essentially lying to them about his purpose to avoid explaining what they wouldn't believe anyway. Why didn't Enki warn more people? If his purpose was to preserve humanity, why not speak to multiple reed walls, ensure multiple survivors built multiple boats, maximise the chance that human life would continue? The texts don't answer this explicitly, but the structure suggests an answer, because warning everyone would have been direct violation of the oath Enki swore with the assembly. Warning one man through indirect speech to a wall was technical circumvention the text presents as acceptable within divine law. Orchestrating mass survival would have been open defiance, breaking not just the spirit but the letter of his commitment. Or perhaps Enki understood that comprehensive survival would simply recreate the problem Enlil was trying to solve. If the entire human population survived the flood, population would remain at the level that generated the noise Enlil found intolerable. The elimination would have failed completely, achieved nothing, and Enlil would simply propose another intervention. But if only a small remnant survived, one family essentially, then population would be dramatically reduced. The noise would end, and Enlil's purpose would be largely achieved, even though humanity continued. This reading suggests Enki's circumvention was carefully calibrated, preserve the species while accepting significant population reduction, allow elimination to partly succeed while ensuring it didn't succeed completely. The tablets describe what Atrahasis brought into the boat. Living things of every kind. The text uses language suggesting pairs or specimens sufficient to enable reproduction after the flood ended. Family members, his own household, the people closest to him, those who trusted his judgment enough to enter the vessel with him. Provisions for extended survival, food, water, materials needed to sustain life during the period of flooding and afterward during recovery. The boat became, in effect, a preservation archive, carrying forward enough biological and human diversity to enable reconstruction once the elimination ended. Then came the instruction to enter the boat and seal it. The text describes this with procedural detail. Atrahasis brought everyone and everything aboard, closed the door, sealed the entry with pitch and bitumen to prevent water infiltration. The vessel was complete, provisioned, sealed. Those inside were committed now. They couldn't leave even if they wanted to, couldn't respond to anything happening outside, could only wait within the darkness of the closed boat for whatever came next. The texts present this moment without sentimentality. No description of Atrahasis looking back at the world he was leaving, no emotional farewell to the life he'd known. Just the practical sequence: construction completed, boat loaded, door sealed, preparation finished. The matter-of-fact tone continues the documentary quality the Atrahasis epic maintains throughout. This is what happened, this is what was done, these are the steps that enabled survival. The text preserves procedure, not emotion, as if the important thing was to record the method so that anyone reading would understand how preservation was achieved. The instructions of Shuruppak, that earlier wisdom text, includes advice from Shuruppak to his son Yasudra about listening carefully to instruction, about taking seriously guidance from those who understand things you don't, about acting on knowledge even when action seems difficult or when others don't understand your reasons. The text presents this as general wisdom, applicable to navigating life's various challenges. But in the context of the flood narrative, it becomes specific preparation. Shuruppak was teaching his son the quality of attention that would enable him to recognize divine warning when it came, to trust instruction that seemed impossible, to act on knowledge that contradicted ordinary experience. Was Shuruppak preparing Ziusudra specifically for the flood, or was this simply wisdom that proved applicable when crisis arrived? The chronology preserved in the Sumerian king list suggests Shuruppak, both the man and the city named for him, existed in the generation immediately before the flood. If Shuruppak somehow knew what was coming, if he understood that comprehensive elimination was being planned, and that survival would require careful attention to divine instruction, then his advice to Ziusudra takes on prophetic quality. He was teaching his son to be ready, to listen, to act when the moment came. But the texts don't explicitly frame it that way. They present Shurupak's wisdom as general guidance, applicable across situations, teaching qualities that would serve anyone well in navigating an uncertain world. That these qualities proved essential during the specific crisis of the flood demonstrates their value, but doesn't require foreknowledge. Perhaps wisdom is always preparation for the crises we can't predict, teaching qualities of attention and response that prove valuable precisely when unprecedented situations arise. The figure inside the sealed boat, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, the same essential person preserved under different names across different textual traditions, represents something specific in these narratives. Not a hero in the conventional sense, not someone with exceptional power or divine ancestry or magical abilities. Just someone who listened when instruction was offered, who acted on knowledge when others didn't, who implemented wisdom systematically even when doing so meant abandoning normal life and trusting information that couldn't be verified until events proved it accurate. This makes survival in these texts something different from survival through strength or luck or divine favour arbitrarily granted. Survival happened through attention, through the capacity to recognise when knowledge was being offered and to act on it appropriately. Enki provided the instruction, but the instruction only saved those capable of receiving it, understanding it, and implementing it, despite the social cost of appearing foolish to neighbours who couldn't see the need for massive boat construction inland. The reed wall spoke to anyone who happened to be near it. but only Atrahasis heard in a way that led to action. The other humans, the population that would be eliminated by the flood, aren't presented in the texts as wicked or deserving destruction. They're presented simply as numerous and loud, as generating the noise that Enlil found intolerable. The texts don't say they refused divine instruction or violated explicit commands. They multiplied and lived and made noise, and this was enough to mark them for elimination. The only distinction the texts draw between them and Atrahasis is that he listened when warning came, and they either didn't hear it or didn't act on it. This raises uncomfortable questions about collective survival and individual preservation. The flood would kill everyone except those in the boat. Atrahasis wasn't saving his neighbours, wasn't organising mass survival, wasn't sharing the instruction Enki had provided. He was implementing the survival strategy he'd been given, which involved preserving his own family and specimens of other life, but not extending the opportunity to the broader population who would be eliminated. Was this selfish, practical, inevitable given the constraints Enki's oath created? The texts don't judge it, don't celebrate Atrahasis for attempting to save others, or condemn him for failing to warn them. They simply describe what happened: instruction given, instruction received, instruction implemented by those capable of implementing it. The sealed boat sat waiting. Inside were the remnant who would survive, the specimens that would enable life to continue, the small population that would emerge after elimination to inherit an emptied earth. Outside was everyone else, continuing their normal lives, unaware that comprehensive flooding was imminent, lacking the knowledge that could have enabled them to prepare even if such preparation had been possible. The text moved toward the flood itself with both inevitability and precision. The elimination would proceed as planned, the preservation would occur as prepared, and the two processes would unfold simultaneously: destruction and survival, ending and continuation, divine intention to eliminate and divine circumvention to preserve, all happening together in the same event. The tablets that carry this narrative forward, CBS 1673, BM 78941, K3375, and fragments scattered across collections, preserve it without fully resolving the questions it raises. Was Atrahasis chosen because of his qualities, or did he develop those qualities because he'd been chosen for earlier instruction during the plague, drought, famine cycles? Did his survival represent divine favour toward one righteous man, or simply the mechanical outcome of knowledge received and implemented effectively? Was he the only one capable of hearing and acting, or the only one Enki warned? The texts don't clarify these questions. They just show the result. One man prepared, everyone else wasn't, and the difference between those groups would determine who existed after the flood and who didn't. The archive beneath the silence. The reading room of the British Museum's Department of Ancient Near Eastern Antiquities maintains controlled temperature and humidity. Tablet BM 78941 rests in storage now, its surface protected from the light and air that could, over decades or centuries, continue the erosion that began when Nineveh burned in 612 Beck. The fire that destroyed King Ashurbanipal's library inadvertently preserved it, baking clay tablets that had been dried but not fired, hardening them into objects durable enough to survive 2,600 years of burial, excavation, cataloguing and study. What was meant to be destroyed became permanent. What should have been lost was preserved precisely because someone tried to eliminate it. There's an irony here that mirrors the flood narrative itself. Enlil attempted comprehensive elimination of human population. The flood came, the waters rose, the noise stopped. But one boat survived, carrying forward the remnant that would rebuild, that would preserve knowledge from before the catastrophe into the world that came after. The elimination failed because someone who understood the plan warned someone who listened, and preservation occurred within the very process designed to achieve erasure. The tablets from Nippur, from Sippar, from Nineveh and Ur and Lhasa, Fragments of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, copied across centuries, buried in archive rooms and temple libraries and palace collections, represent a similar kind of preservation. These weren't casual writings. Many someones across generations, decided these texts mattered enough to copy, to preserve, to transmit forward through time. Scribal schools taught students to reproduce them. Libraries maintained collections that included them. When cities fell and archives burned, other cities held copies, ensuring the narratives survived the loss of any single repository. Why did these specific stories, the Ijiji rebellion, human creation, divine population control attempts, the flood, Ziusudra's survival, Adapa's refused immortality, the king list's division of time into before and after, why did these require preservation? They weren't practical texts like accounting records or legal documents. They weren't royal propaganda celebrating specific kings' achievements. They were narratives about crises, moments when the cosmic order nearly collapsed, when the relationship between divine authority and created beings reached breaking points, when decisions were made that shaped fundamental conditions of existence going forward. Perhaps that's exactly why they required preservation. These texts were case studies in how systems handle crises, how authority responds when subjects refuse compliance, how knowledge enables survival when power attempts elimination, how consensus decisions can be undermined by those with information and will to circumvent them. They documented not ideal conditions, but breaking points, the moments when normal operations failed and something unprecedented had to happen to prevent total collapse or to achieve comprehensive reset. The Atrahasis epic, with its methodical record of escalating interventions, preserved a pattern, identified problem, propose solution, achieve consensus, implement solution, observe circumvention, identify renewed problem, escalate solution. The text doesn't celebrate this pattern or condemn it. It documents it with procedural precision, as if recording case law for future reference. What happened when divine authority tried to reduce human population? This sequence occurred. What was the outcome? Partial success, requiring complete elimination as final intervention. The Eridugenesis, fragmentary as it survives, preserved the Sumerian perspective on the same events. The flood came from the gods' decision, but Ziusudra received warning, built a boat, survived with a remnant. The text emphasizes Ziusudra's piety, his proper relationship with divine authority, suggesting his survival wasn't just tactical, knowledge received and implemented, but also ethical, a result of maintaining appropriate reverence even when others didn't. The instructions of Shuruppak preserved practical wisdom, how to navigate uncertain conditions, how to listen for important information, how to maintain relationships that might prove crucial during crisis. The text framed this as general guidance, applicable across situations, but positioned within the broader narrative of pre-flood Shuruppak warning his son Ziusudra. This wisdom became specific preparation for the discontinuity that was coming. Pay attention, trust instruction from reliable sources, act on knowledge even when action seems strange to those who don't understand. The Sumerian king list preserved the administrative consequence, time divided into before and after, kingship reorganized, human conditions changed in ways the text encoded through progressively shortening reign lengths. The flood was the boundary event that separated antediluvian existence from post-diluvian reality, requiring new structures, new relationships, new frameworks for understanding how human society operated under divine authority. These texts together create a multi-layered record of what the Sumerians and their successors apparently considered vital knowledge, that authority could be challenged and sometimes successfully resisted, that knowledge enabled survival under conditions meant to prevent survival, that divine. Consensus didn't guarantee unified implementation when factional interests diverged, that comprehensive elimination could be attempted, but preservation could occur if someone with sufficient understanding chose to enable it, that crises reshaped fundamental conditions, and that institutions could be reconstituted after catastrophes but not necessarily in identical form. This is sophisticated political and theological understanding. The texts don't present divine authority as arbitrary or capricious, but they also don't present it as absolute or unchallengeable. They show gods following procedures, convening assemblies, achieving consensus, binding each other by oaths, suggesting even supreme authority operated within frameworks that constrained unilateral action. They show those frameworks being circumvented through clever interpretation and factional disagreement, suggesting consensus was formal rather than genuine, that competing interests existed within divine hierarchy just as they existed within human society. And they show knowledge as the critical resource that enabled weaker parties to navigate systems controlled by stronger ones. Enki's assistance to humanity wasn't direct application of power against Enlil's interventions. It was provision of information, which gods to worship to end plague, how to build boats to survive floods, how to behave before supreme authority to survive judgment. The information only helped those capable of receiving it, understanding it, and implementing it, those who listened, like Atrahasis and Ziusudra, or those who trusted it, like Adapa, even when that trust proved misplaced. But for those who could use it, knowledge substituted for power enabled influence over outcomes that raw strength couldn't control. The preservation of these texts across centuries suggests Mesopotamian civilization found this understanding valuable enough to transmit carefully through time. The copying wasn't casual. These were training texts for scribal schools, the material that educated each generation of literate professionals who would administer temples and palaces, keep records, compose documents, teach the next generation. Learning to read and write cuneiform meant copying these texts, absorbing their content, internalizing their perspective on how authority operated and how knowledge enabled navigation of authority's structures. What were the scribes teaching? On one level, practical skills, how to form cuneiform signs, how to organize narrative, how to maintain proper grammar in Sumerian and Akkadian. But on another level, they were teaching political theology, how divine and human authority actually functioned in practice rather than ideal theory, how systems that appeared absolute contained vulnerabilities, how knowledge could be leveraged by those lacking power, how survival was possible, even under conditions designed to prevent it, how institutions reorganized after catastrophic failures. This perspective might explain why these texts survived when so much else from the ancient world was lost. They weren't just stories. They were instruction manuals disguised as mythology, case studies in navigating authority encoded in narratives about gods and floods and kings with impossible reign lengths. The surface level was engaging: dramatic events, divine conflicts, comprehensive catastrophe, and narrow survival. But beneath the surface was systematic analysis of how crises develop, how authority attempts solutions, how solutions get circumvented, how outcomes differ from intentions, and how survivors carry forward into reconstituted orders. The question that opened this exploration was specific. What do Sumerian texts reveal about what happened when humans first refused to obey the Anunnaki? The tablets answered not with a single event, but with a sequence. Igigi rebellion established that refusal was possible. Human creation occurred to solve the labour crisis that rebellion created. Human population grew beyond intended bounds. Divine interventions attempted correction. Human adaptations circumvented interventions. Escalation led to elimination decision. Knowledge enabled preservation. Flood reduced population. Order was reconstituted with modified parameters. The refusal wasn't one moment, but a pattern. Humans multiplying when divine comfort required reduction. Surviving interventions meant to thin their numbers, adapting around each pressure applied. Whether this was intentional resistance or simply effective survival, the texts leave ambiguous. What's clear is that divine authority attempted control and found it more difficult than expected, that humans possessed or received resources, Enki's knowledge, their own inherited rationality, capacity for adaptation, that enabled them to persist when persistence wasn't supposed to be possible. And the text preserved this not as human triumph over unjust gods, or as divine victory over rebellious humans, but as complicated interaction where both sides had legitimate perspectives, where authority had real problems requiring solutions, where populations had real needs requiring preservation, and where the conflict between these couldn't be resolved except through catastrophe that partly succeeded and partly failed depending on which outcome you measured. Enlil achieved population reduction, Enki achieved species preservation. Humanity continued, but in diminished form. Divine authority was vindicated, but not absolutely. No party got everything they wanted, every party got something they needed. This nuanced understanding that crises don't have clear heroes or villains, that authority and resistance both have legitimate claims, that outcomes are usually mixed rather than absolute, that knowledge enables survival but doesn't guarantee comfort or equality, that catastrophists reshape conditions rather than definitively resolving conflicts. This is what the tablets beneath the silence preserve. The archives burned, the cities fell, the civilization that created these texts vanished, but the clay remained, scattered across Mesopotamian sites, excavated by archaeologists, catalogued by museums, translated by scholars, accessible now to anyone curious about what questions people were asking 700 years ago and what answers they thought worth preserving. The texts don't tell you what to believe about divine authority or human autonomy or the legitimacy of resistance. They show you what happened, or what the Sumerians believed happened, or what they thought it was important to remember as having happened, when these questions became concrete rather than theoretical. When divine authority demanded compliance, and human populations demonstrated they possessed resources to resist. When comprehensive elimination was attempted, and knowledge enabled circumvention. When the world was reorganized after catastrophe and had to figure out how to structure relationships to prevent the same crisis from recurring. These aren't comfortable answers. They don't resolve into clear lessons or moral certainty. They sit in the ambiguity of complex systems, where everyone has reasons for their actions, where no solution satisfies all parties, where power and knowledge compete for influence over outcomes, where catastrophes happen and survivors carry forward into uncertain futures. The tablets preserved this ambiguity deliberately, copied it across generations, transmitted it through time as if uncertainty itself was the lesson, that simple answers were inadequate, that authority was complicated, that survival required wisdom and attention, that knowledge mattered but wasn't sufficient, that crises reshaped conditions rather than solving problems definitively. If you've stayed with this exploration through all these chapters, through the Agigi rebellion and human creation, through plague and drought and famine, through Enlil's escalation and Enki's circumvention, through the flood decision and Atrahasis' survival, through Adappa's refused immortality, and the king list's reorganized time, if these fragments of ancient tablets have held your attention through the hours it takes to examine them properly, then perhaps what you've found is what the Sumerian scribes were preserving, evidence that complexity is honest, that ambiguity reflects reality. More accurately than certainty, that the questions humans face about authority and autonomy and knowledge and survival don't resolve but recur, requiring each generation to navigate them with whatever wisdom they've inherited and whatever understanding they can develop. The tablets rest in climate-controlled storage, in Oxford and London and Philadelphia and Paris, in Baghdad and Istanbul and Berlin. The texts have been photographed, digitized, made accessible through online databases like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative. Anyone with internet access can view images of the original tablets, read translations in multiple languages, study the questions these ancient texts preserved, the archive beneath the silence has become accessible above it, available to anyone curious enough to ask what people were thinking about when they pressed these wedges into clay and fired them for permanence, ensuring that even when the cities fell and the civilization ended, the questions would survive. And perhaps that's the final thing the text preserve, the understanding that questions matter more than answers, that documenting the crisis is more important than claiming to have solved it, that showing what happened, even ambiguously, even with gaps and uncertainties, serves future generations better than offering false certainty about what it all meant. The Sumerians created an archive of complexity, preserved it through catastrophe, transmitted it through time. Now it sits waiting, these fragments of fired clay, carrying forward the memory of when humans first demonstrated they could refuse what divine authority demanded, and what happened because they could.